Thanks everyone for joining today. Today is our last seminar of our CES seminar series on sustainability planning. Please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. As we go through the presentation, feel free to type in any questions that you have in the chat window. We've gotten a list of questions in advance that we'll go through at the end here. And if you have any technical questions or issues, feel free to reach out to Casey at the email below. As always, we will follow up with the presentation slides as well as the recording after the seminar. And so let's get started here. Welcome everyone. This is Zach Blum, Vice President of Sustainability and Renewables at Competitive Energy Services. And before we jump in, I just give a quick little overview. Most people joining are clients or people that we've spoken with in the past, or state administrators. And so most people know who we are, but for those that don't, we operate primarily in the Northeast, but have large national clients on the West Coast and throughout the country, as well as into the Canadian provinces and abroad. So we primarily offer kind of three buckets of services. The first one is procurement, which is where we started. And generally that contains market monitoring for fossil fuels, whether it be gas, oil, electricity, natural gas, as well as tracking for financial analysis. The other big bucket is consulting, which we've done a lot more in the last decade or so. And that revolves around analysis of on-site generation, whether it be fuel cells, combined heat and power, and in the last 5 years, more so battery storage or on-site solar. In the final bucket is full service, which is really a combination of both of those first two buckets, where it's a customized agreement for both procurement or consulting. And so we've been focusing a lot more on that consulting bucket, and we believe that our analysis and work for the last 2 decades on the procurement makes us better when it comes to sustainability planning or analysis, and vice versa. Having knowledge of the growing sustainability and distributed generation market helps inform our procurement policy work. So without further ado, we're going to kick off here. Just a quick caveat, given the audience members here really come from many geographic areas or different levels of understandings, we're trying to speak to this large participant, private corporate energy users, public universities, municipalities, etc. And so, as a result, we're going to cover these topics trying to address multiple starting points. And so if there's additional questions after, please reach out if you'd like to discuss in more detail. And so we'll get kind of a high level here just on what we're going to cover. The first is measure, and so that's really with more regards to emissions accounting. Second piece is strategizing, and that's looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions reductions and options that pertain mostly to electricity and electrical, beneficial electrification, focusing on both transportation and thermal needs being converted over to scope 2. And so we'll talk a little bit about scope 1, but the bulk of this analysis and discussion is going to center around the electricity side and importing or self-generation. And the last piece, after you've measured and strategized and come up with a plan, is act. And so in this portion, we'll review in more detail what are the renewable energy credits and options that are out there, both on-site, off-site, and through various utilities. So without further ado, we'll jump in here. And given the large grouping of people in different geographies and starting points, we thought we'd just start with a few terms to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about emissions types, there's two, scope 1 and 2. Scope 1 is direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled. Scope 2 is indirect emissions. Generally, that's electricity or steam brought in through a pipe. The last one is emissions calculations here that relate to location-based or market-based. And location-based is emissions factors from the regional average power mix, and market-based is specific to the supply of electricity consumed by that provider. And the last two components here that fit into this overall discussion are RECs and RPS. RECs are a market-based instrument that convey the rights to the environmental attribute separate from the power itself. Every megawatt hour equals 1 REC. And RPS is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a regulatory mandate to increase generation from renewable sources such as wind or solar. And so we'll go through in more detail how these all fit together. But as a starting point here, let's go into section 1, which is more the measurement side. And so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Evan Perkins, Managing Director of Consulting Services at CES.
Thanks, Zach. As the old adage goes, it's hard to manage what you don't measure. So when we think about the starting point for end users to think about sustainability planning and to come up with goals and strategies to increase their renewable energy portfolio, one of the key starting points is coming up with a baseline and inventory of where your emissions stand today. Most end users, whether it's a private organization, a nonprofit, a university, or even state entities, all different entities generally look at 3 primary categories of emissions when setting a baseline and then tracking their progress and emissions footprint over time. What we have up on the slide here is what we refer to as those 3 buckets: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Today's discussion, since we're talking about grid electricity and renewable energy credits, is primarily focused and tied to an end user's Scope 2 emissions, which again you can see on the slide here, and those are tied to purchased electricity, steam, or other energy for own use at facilities. There is a lot to cover with Scope 1 and 3 as well, so we'd be glad to follow up with folks offline if you have any questions on either of those scopes. There's just a lot to cover there, so glad to discuss that in whatever detail you guys would like to. But for the purposes of Scope 2, one of the interesting things looking backward is that end users who've been maintaining inventories now for 5, 10 plus years, across the country, we've generally seen Scope 2 emissions decline for end users, regardless of whether end users have taken direct action to either, say, increase energy efficiency at their facilities or to go out and acquire, certain renewable energy attributes. The reason for that is that as a country, our generation mix, what we use to produce electricity for fuels, has gotten quite a bit cleaner over the last 20 years, kind of looking back to the beginning of deregulation in a lot of parts of the country. What we have up on the slide here is different measures of how green grids are across the U.S. Starting at the top, SPP represents the plains in the Midwest, ERCOT, Texas, and then New England, California, New York. Basically, across all these regions, we've seen the emissions intensity in the power grid decline, which has really been driven by each region listed here phasing out less efficient coal and oil generation units and replacing those units with more efficient combined cycle gas-fired generation, and over the last 10 years, increasingly more wind and solar interconnected to the grid. This is important because, again, for those who've been tracking their emissions without taking any action, they're seeing that share of their inventory for total emissions decline. As the grid has gotten greener, customers have seen benefits there, and moving forward, we expect this trend to continue. The big difference, if we look, backwards 20 years and forward 20 years, is that over the last 20 years, the big decline in emissions, like I said, has been driven by getting rid of those most carbon-intensive, least efficient generation plants. We're now beginning to plateau a bit with the emissions intensity on the grid, and moving forward, the additional declines coming up in the near future are really going to be driven state by state depending on which states are mandating more renewable energy to come from specifically new wind and solar. We've seen major advances in both of those generation technologies here over the last 10 years. And as individual states, pick and choose which technologies to support here to continue driving the emissions on the grid down, we're going to start seeing, different states and different regions again start to decouple a bit. For the graph we have up on the slide, we're showing our internal estimates of what the New England grid emissions are going to look like over the next 20 years, which, as you can see, we think will likely be reduced from right now between 400 and 500 pounds per megawatt hour down below 200 pounds per megawatt hour. So a really significant decline. In this case, if we dig into what's driving this decline on the next slide, what we can see is that it's a mix of individual states going after much more renewable technology and generation like offshore wind and utility scale solar. In New England right now, between 2020 and 2030, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have invested significantly to increase offshore wind development off of Cape Cod and southern New England. That's going to have a pretty significant impact, continuing to drive down emissions on the grid. Also, Massachusetts' efforts to bring in large-scale hydro from Quebec and to continue their own development of in-state solar through the SMART program. These different programs add up over time, which, as you can see, have a cumulative impact that'll continue driving down emissions on the grid, assuming that we don't start electrifying things aggressively. So those are the trends as people think about their own scope 2 emissions and what they can do. You need to think about, am I in a grid that's going to get greener over time? Am I in a grid where I'm already contributing payments to help the grid get greener through things like renewable portfolio standards or other specific state programs? These factors are important to think about when you start, one, understanding where you've been, where you're going, but also if you want to set certain renewable energy targets or procurement structures, you need to have these factors baked into those strategies and incorporated effectively. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Zach to talk about beneficial electrification.
Thanks, Evan. Appreciate the context here. So as we think about kind of the strategize portion, we wanted to give a little bit more context to this disparity that Evan just talked about with regards to the RPS. And so the RPS, once again, is that state mandate for state-sponsored contracting of new renewable resources. And so, while these percentages are still fairly low in most states, they're increasing pretty drastically over the next decade. And just one example here, if you look at New York, they're going from the mid-30s up to 70% in the next decade. And New Jersey is kind of similar to some of these other New England states. They're starting off at a lower point, but getting a similar, 30-40% jump over the next decade. And there's others such as California and Hawaii that aren't even in here, but they have a 100% RPS goal within the next 2 to 3 decades. And so we bring this up because as these RPS percentages continue to increase, we believe an interesting dichotomy is going to unfold, similar to that regional versus state action claim that Evan just described. In this instance, it's related more to the RECs from the RPS. And so currently, guidance from WRI, the World Resources Institute, when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting standards, they limit the ability for a retail electricity user to claim any benefits from the RPS or RECs that are procured on their behalf. Instead, the prevailing thought is as more renewable get installed, the emissions on the grid decrease, and the end users will have a lower carbon content for every megawatt hour that they consume off the grid. And so that's, their benefit. But, currently, just by way of an example, in Massachusetts, for every megawatt hour that's imported, the RPS or REC is about $25 per megawatt hour. And so an annual load of about 100,000 megawatt hours represents a pretty big cost, about $2.5 million annually. And so the crux of the issue is that, while the retail suppliers are the entities per the RPS that need to meet those obligations, which they are, they're really just passing those costs along to the end users. And so the problem is if both parties make that claim, the action is going to be double counted. So we'll get into it a little bit more later on, but just want to set that context first. And so I'm bringing up the same chart here that Eben showed recently, just showing that decline in cost. And historically the grid was carbon intensive, lots of coal and oil, and as Eben alluded to, now there's more natural gas fired generation, which is cleaner, and there's also increasing renewables on the grid. And so as a result, the grid's gotten much, much less carbon intensive. And as just discussed, the grid's going to continue as we trend towards these RPS goals, increasing over time. And so over the last decade, the cost of gas has been historically low. And the cost of electricity of all these state ISO compliance costs are getting higher and higher. And so as a result, many end users choose to produce their own electricity through a CHP or a combined heat and power plant. It's because those associated emissions were previously cleaner and less costly than importing off the grid. Now, emissions from a CHP vary depending on many factors, but at a high level, it's the technology itself, the fuel inputs, whether it's ULSD, or natural gas. And very important is the utilization. How much is it used throughout the year? And so generally speaking, the less utilization and the dirtier fuel, the higher the emissions. The more gas and more utilization, the lower the emissions. Right? It's important to note, that when we're talking about CHPs generating electricity, what they're also doing at the same time is displacing a portion of their thermal needs that don't need to be called on by their boilers. So if you really wanted to compare the efficiency of electricity from the CHP to the grid, you would need to incorporate that thermal need piece. And so what we've done is try to strip out the thermal portion by accounting for a slightly lower heat rate. And what I want to show you is really this range of the CHP. It could be anywhere in that 600 to 1,000 pounds of CO2e per megawatt hour. Once again, it just depends on that specific asset. And so what I'm showing this line for is essentially anything above the line, the pink, is effectively your grid emissions are above, and it would be cleaner if you were able to self-generate. And if it's below, then it would be cleaner to import off the grid. Once again, this is only through the lens of carbon. It has nothing to do with costs or goals, reliability, redundancy, etc. This is just looking through that lens of what's the carbon content. And so as we think about this growing RPS percentage, the trend of declining grid emissions are very likely to continue. And at a basic level, the on-site combustion, while variable, is static. It's within this range that we just discussed. But it can really never go lower than that range. While the grids, on the other hand, have actually decreased below that threshold and are continuing their decline. And so just to kind of paint an example here, assuming a load that was about 100,000 megawatt hours in New England, using the regional approach here. In 2005, 2015, and 2025, that same 100,000 megawatt hours would have been about 40,000, 30,000, and in the future about 10,000 metric tons proportionally. And so you can see this continued decline, and that's before we've even reached the 100% grid mark. And so I guess as a starting point here, just disregard these red and green lines. What I want to illustrate is the source of energy for a client that currently has a CHP, but is going to transition over to a ground source heat pump, using a beneficial electrification strategy along with transportation, etc. So at the bottom of the screen in gray is their existing and planned future solar. The blue and orange represent the combustion and steam turbine generation from their existing CHP, and the yellow is the grid purchases. As you can see in 2030, that grid purchase goes up drastically. That's effectively when the CHP has been decommissioned and when the ground source heat pump system is installed and you have this low temperature hot water system that will meet all of your thermal needs. And so it's, I think, pretty clear that, from these declining emissions, you can really get quite a benefit of converting from scope 1 over to scope 2. Now, if we now think back to that RPS discussion, the green line, what we're assuming here is that the RECs from the RPS are not included in your accounting standard. And the red, which is currently the baseline, from WRI's guidance, it is obviously much lower here. And so what we're trying to show is if the RPS RECs were included, what would your REC procurement volume need to be to reach carbon neutrality? And I think it becomes pretty clear if you go out to 2050, the amount of RECs you would need to procure just to reach carbon neutrality is almost 10x from the no RPS RECs to assuming the RPS RECs are included. And what that means is that the marginal cost for every metric ton removed is going to be very, very high in this other scenario. And it really starts to call into question, if you're using 300,000 megawatt hours and your emissions have now dropped down below 1,000 metric tons annually, what are the, I guess, benefits that you're getting for that REC procurement? So I think we'll get back to it a little bit later, but this was a handful of questions rotate around this kind of REC treatment piece. Now, the last slide here before I hand it over to Matt is really looking at this beneficial electrification impact. And so similar to the last slide, we're showing here in yellow, these are current grid purchases for an annual load. In orange is effectively what the estimated grid purchases would be post-electrification. And in blue, we're showing a general solar profile that would meet that 100% needs. And it's really hard, obviously, to install both based on land as well as, resiliency, reliability, availability, solar behind the meter. And so we're assuming this is an off-site, solar project aimed. But we thought it was important just to kind of note these really key factors that will drive your strategy. How much are you growing in the future? What are you getting rid of for buildings? What building type is it? Is it lab space? Is it data centers? Is it office? Is it dorms? What type of on-site generation will you both retire in the example of the CHP or install in case of solar, storage, or others? How does that impact your reliability and redundancy? And then it starts to get into the supply side for procurement of renewables. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who's going to delve in a little bit more onto the acting side and give a high level of what the renewable energy credit acquisition options are.
Thanks, Zach. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, coming through great.
Great. So Zach highlighted how much and when to buy renewables is going to depend heavily on your strategy and your own methodology for accounting, your own campus plans or facility plans. And those nuances are important to understand before it comes time to act, because they're going to influence what types of renewables or when you might be buying those renewables. But when it comes time to actually act and procure those renewables, there's a number of varieties which can be difficult to put into context. And since we're kicking off summer here, I thought I would try to put everything in terms of ice cream. So we like to think about renewable energy in two fundamental categories. The first being unbundled. Unbundled is where the renewable attributes, the RECs, the renewable benefit of that megawatt hour being generated without the emission of carbon is stripped away from the electricity itself. This is opposed to bundled, which includes both the RECs and the energy, and I'll get to that in a moment. But in the unbundled category, overwhelmingly the most popular way that folks are currently procuring their renewables is through voluntary RECs. And in ice cream terms, you can think of this as just simply buying ice cream. You don't necessarily get to control the source or the flavor, but you do know that it's genuine ice cream, and ice cream is good, and that's what you want as part of your strategy. This has become the most popular option because it's cheap, it's flexible, you can buy in the spot market, you can buy for variety of contract terms, and therefore it's become the overwhelming choice to procure renewable energy. One step up from voluntary RECs, we have compliance RECs. In this case, in ice cream terms, you can think of it as having control over the flavor of ice cream or the location that that ice cream is coming from. And in order to get that level of specificity, you have to pay a little bit more. Compliance RECs, you're competing with other suppliers and utilities who have to buy these RECs to comply with the renewable portfolio standard that Zach and Eben commented on. And therefore, these come with a cost premium in comparison to voluntary RECs. But they're another alternative that can be just as flexible in terms of contract terms or timing of purchases and represent the other side of the unbundled renewable energy option. Now, you can compare unbundled to bundled, and many organizations are looking to go further with their renewable purchases. Sure, when you're buying unbundled renewable energy, you're creating more general demand for ice cream, you're buying more ice cream, therefore there should be a higher demand for ice cream generally, but it's much harder to attribute your individual demand to a new ice cream or renewable project feeding into that global supply here. And for that reason, we've seen many folks move towards the bundled options. And the first option under bundled that I'd like to go into is a utility or a supply product. In this case, you as one of many buyers might be buying into a green tariff or a green supply product from a supplier that is going to offer you something that's greener than just the grid mix. Usually comes with a slight premium to that grid mix, and that's important to understand. These vary quite a bit from utility to utility or supplier to supplier. We've really seen them catch on in regions where regulated markets exist. You don't have the option to go to a supplier and buy whatever product you want, so utilities are offering a greener option for those who opt to do this. And in ice cream terms, this is the equivalent of having some third party, some utility, go out and contract with multiple different ice cream makers. That ice cream might come with different flavors, different levels of quality. And for that reason, it's important to go into the nuances of what that green tariff is offering you, what sort of things you can claim, and what sort of renewables you might be supporting. But fundamentally, when that utility or the supplier is going out to buy that ice cream, they're making a contract and therefore making a much greater commitment to that ice cream long term. Beyond utility or supply products, you've got DG projects or distributed generation projects. And in ice cream terms, this would be the equivalent of maybe going out and buying a cow or two to keep in your yard, buying some homemade ice cream equipment, and making your own ice cream. Now, this is going to be hard to do at scale, especially depending on the needs of your organization, how many people want ice cream, or how much energy are you actually using. And a lot of the incentives for distributed generation projects are state and region dependent. So whether or not you can participate in any sort of net metering with maybe a small facility down the road, it's all going to depend on existing state policy. And those sort of limitations around the homemade ice cream or the DG project option lead us to a third bundled option, which is a power purchase agreement or a virtual power purchase agreement. There's a small moo there. Now, in this option, you're making a direct commitment to a project. So you can think of it in ice cream terms like buying into a share of a farm and ice cream making factory, and by committing to buy everything they generate, you're allowing a new ice cream farm and factory to come into the global supply mix. Therefore, you know there's that much more ice cream in the world. The same is true for renewable energy. It's a long-term commitment to a project where you're receiving the renewable benefits of that project, and by making that long-term commitment, you've brought that new renewable project onto whatever grid it's operating on, and you know that that's increasing much more directly the global supply of renewable energy. Now, because you're making that commitment, you can see this arrow at the bottom of the slide, that's generally going to come with a higher level of financial complexity and potentially risk as compared with the simple voluntary REC purchase that many are familiar with. And so that's important to keep in mind and sort of balance that risk versus the benefits. And as I've been highlighting as I go through here, really, there are two key differentiators choosing your path on this matrix here. The first one being that additionality claim, meaning, was the project, is the project's existence resulting from the actions I took, or would the project exist otherwise? And then also the geography. Some of these options may be more or less attractive to you depending on what regions or your organization operates in, and maybe what areas you're targeting for renewable energy. Now, how do I pick, which pathway to go on? There's a lot of options here. One common way might be to look at what your peers are doing and what's going on in the broader sustainability community. So we're showing in a graphic here renewable sourcing by RE100 members over a recent time span. And RE100 is a collection of prominent corporates and businesses, both national and multinational, who have committed to 100% renewable energy. And you can see from this chart, in 2015, that dark blue, this is that unbundled REC, the pure ice cream cone, falls from 60% in 2015 down to 43% in 2018. And filling in that gap is almost exclusively dark red here, which represents the offsite PPA or VPPA, which was represented by a cow on the prior slide, but is a much more direct commitment, provides a lot more additionality, and this is emblematic of a shift in the sustainability world towards greater additionality, looking to do more with your action, make more of a direct impact, and attribute your renewable energy commitment to a new renewable project on the grid. And this is a trend that obviously exists in this graphic for corporates and businesses, but we're also seeing similar movements in the campus. But when it comes time to make your own decisions, you're going to have to look at some key evaluation metrics, and we've listed those for you on this last slide. First, and perhaps most obviously, is the cost of those renewable energy attributes, the RECs, the renewable energy that you're buying. How does that compare between your alternative options? What is that trade-off between entering into a virtual power purchase agreement versus just buying voluntary RECs on the voluntary market? And along with that, what sort of risk tolerance does your organization have? Can you make a long-term commitment? Do you feel comfortable with your future situation and how many renewable attributes you're going to need in the future? And inherent in that cost discussion is the additionality piece that I've highlighted in the prior couple slides. They're somewhat related here because by committing to a project and providing that additionality, you inevitably have to make a longer term and somewhat riskier commitment. That's not to say that it can't be done in ways that mitigate risk or are financially attractive to your organization, but it is much more nuanced than a simple unbundled REC purchase. Third, we have the location. Now, most folks, I think, focused on renewables in their region. That one's fairly obvious. You're supporting a new renewable project on your grid. That electricity is going to be fed into the grid where you buy your electricity. That it's going to be creating green jobs or other benefits for your community versus an out-of-region project, which might be harder to directly tie to. We've also seen folks in the location department looking at a relative amount of carbon displaced. And one way to think about this would be, if you put a new renewable project on a dirtier grid, it's going to displace a relatively greater amount of carbon than a new renewable project on a cleaner grid. Now, that's not something that everyone's using as a metric, but it is something worth thinking about when you compare your options. And lastly, and not least, is timing. What's the online date for the project? This is becoming especially important given COVID-19 and some of the supply chain and permitting delays that we've seen projects confront. The term of the contract that you're signing up for, is this going to align with your goals and your needs? As Zach highlighted, those might be changing over the next 10, 20 years as the grid gets greener and greener. So aligning those terms with your objectives is going to be key. And last, I want to leave you with one key consideration related to policy and the opportunities that those have created for folks. We're showing in the picture here a 24 megawatt solar installation in Cranston, Rhode Island. This is a project that we assisted the city of Providence in negotiating a few years ago. and it's a sizable project. Providence will eventually be able to claim the renewable benefits associated with this project and is also seeing some financial benefits as well. And we wanted to raise this because in our own home state of Maine here, where I'm coming to you from, just a couple of years ago, many of our clients here had no opportunity to look at in-state projects, especially in a way that was financially attractive to them because of the limitations on net metering policy and the limited state subsidies for renewables. Due to some changes in policy last year, that's really been entirely flipped. And now we've seen many organizations that are looking at projects that are not only going to provide them with in-state renewable energy, but do so at a cost benefit to them. And I just want to bring that example up because it highlights how following the policy, understanding what the nuances are in your state or your region, and how that might influence what opportunities are available to you is going to be key in setting a long-term strategy. The landscape can change drastically in just a few years' time. And while you don't want to just wait around for the policy to change, it is an important thing to keep in mind before you go making a long-term commitment that you might not be comfortable with. So with that, I will pass it back to Zach to cover some key takeaways and bring us into the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Matt. So yeah, just key takeaways. Based on the transitioning away from oil and coal to a cleaner fuel like gas, along with the increased renewables, the grid's getting cleaner. Certain grids or regions are already cleaner when it comes to self-generation from fossil fuel based, and other grids on a similar trajectory. And people are taking advantage, of this by trying to electrify everything from the thermal to the transportation side. And there's lots of technologies that are out there, and there's other ways you could do it, which we're glad to discuss or probably already have, whether it be biomass or biofuels. There's other ways to reduce your scope 1 without the electrification piece, but we really wanted to focus on what we think is a very interesting topic specific to electrification, as well as scope 2 and how the grid is changing over time. And last, many flavors of RECs exist, and some are very tasty, while others are just vanilla. But it doesn't mean it's not ice cream. It's still a REC. It's still ice cream. So with that, we will jump into the Q&A. Once again, feel free to send in the chat. And once we go through all those and the questions that were provided in advance, we can open it up if people want to ask and unmute. So first question here, I'll give to you, Matt, is please discuss getting started and first steps for towns with limited staff devoted to energy management.
Sure, yeah. Besides the obvious, which might be to call CES, but I think just like we laid out here, the first step is to measure. You got to start with understanding your baseline. What's your own greenhouse gas portfolio? Where are the sources of the greatest emissions? You have to have a baseline to start from in order to understand and start to develop a strategy to focus on those big emission sources. Along with that, I think we've seen a lot of clients of ours and folks we're working with try to jump right into a strategy without necessarily putting together the right group of stakeholders. You need to have the right people in the room, and even though you might not have, as in this question, a staff devoted to energy management, you're going to have members of your organization who are going to need to buy into whatever strategy you come up with, and whether that's a finance person, whether that's your facilities managers, whoever, making sure you identify those key stakeholders, bring them together, and have everyone contribute and understand that strategy is a key first step, or at least close second step once you've developed your baseline.
Thanks, Matt. We had quite a few questions related to storage. I'll hand this one to you, Evan. What are the implications when it comes to carbon accounting if I utilize a battery storage system? And given Evan's
technology, we're seeing more and more of it.
Keep going, Evan.
Take that, Zach.
Yeah, go for it.
batteries are a technology a lot of you are likely hearing and seeing more in the news these days. Right now, certain states have relatively attractive financial incentives for batteries, including California and Massachusetts in particular. So certain customers and some of your peers are actually starting to put some of these technologies in their own facilities to essentially store power, typically in the middle of the night, and discharge the following day. When you think about the carbon impacts of shifting around your own electricity demand from the grid, it's interesting, over the course of the year, on average, you actually slightly increase your emissions footprint by using a battery. It's because when you charge electricity into a lithium-ion battery specifically, it takes a bit more electricity to charge than you can later then tap into to discharge. It's just based on losses within the system. It's physics that are hard to avoid. So by having to take on a little bit more from the grid than being able to displace later on, the accounting actually slightly ticks up over time on average. There's a new school of thought emerging about how to think about that accounting rather than looking at the average emissions on the grid to say, if you would not have the battery, there may need to be a power plant that's a bit less efficient come online to serve that load you're now considering displacing by what you're storing during off-peak times and discharging on peak. So the question of this average emissions versus marginal emissions, this is something a number of you and your peers are thinking about. Don't want to get too in the weeds here, so we're glad to follow up with any of you if you want to discuss more detail. But I generally characterize it that on average your emissions increase, but the thinking of this is evolving, rightly so. So again, glad to dig into that offline if folks are interested.
Thanks, Evan. Next question here is, how do you look at carbon offsets and RECs, timing of purchase? And I'll hand this one over to Simon, who assists with running a lot of the procurements, whether it be for carbon offsets or RECs or CES clients.
Thanks, Zach. So the primary thing that we focus on with any REC or offset procurement is ultimately the customer's goals. A lot of the things that Matt mentioned previously, pricing, location, those come into play a lot, sometimes intertwined. For example, if you're not specific on your location, you can procure RECs for as low as $1 or less per REC. You can procure a carbon offset for a similar low price, but if you specify more on location, you can get up to over $400 per REC. Or in some cases for carbon offsets, upwards of $20, $25 per metric ton or per carbon offset. With carbon offsets, there's a bit more nuance that comes into play. There's a larger range of project types and technologies that one can choose from when considering a purchase. Landfill gas, afforestation, efficient cooking equipment in rural villages, and then also a number of potential project benefits, either as direct results of the project or additional initiatives that are created using project funding that some customers will look at and see as an additional factor in making their decisions. So ultimately, it's a conversation that needs to be had about what are the priorities that the customer wants to place when evaluating the purchase. And if there's uncertainty around that, then the first step is maybe putting out a large, very broad solicitation and evaluating some of the results that come back to better understand what it is the customer is looking for. On the timing question, luckily there's a fair amount of flexibility with regards to how you choose to make a purchase. You can make a purchase a couple years ahead of time for the year that you're looking to offset. You can make a purchase right up and ahead of the year, during the year, or once the year is over and you have a full accounting of your emissions. So you have a lot of flexibility. If you need to delay a purchase, you're able to do that. And so we can easily work with customers to create a strategy and work through a purchase process on the scale that they're looking for.
Thanks, Simon. And the last question sent in advance is, which organization or organizations has the most ambitious sustainability plan from your perspective and are most focused on 2050 or more near term like 2025? And so before I answer the first part, I guess I would just start by saying what would be really helpful is understanding, what your peers are doing as well. A lot of activity occurs at the large, Fortune 500 corporates that have really large energy costs, and with that comes economies of scale. And so it's helpful if you're a university, whether you're public or private, to look at peers that are similar. Municipalities are different from a small to a large metropolitan, and corporates, have really been out in front of this, but we've seen a lot of progress and trends kind of continuing in the same vein in the last few years in the other markets as well. Recently, Microsoft actually came out with a very ambitious plan, which was, previously unheard of, which is not a carbon reduction or even a carbon neutrality goal, but it's a cumulative net carbon impact, like erasing everything since inception of all their carbon from day one. And so, that is, currently the most ambitious goal that's out there. But I think comparing yourself to Microsoft and their, Treasury war chest might not be necessarily applicable for everyone attending today. So that's why I gave the caveat of understand your peers and trends and where people are going. So I'll start with some of the questions that have been coming in here. First one is, why is the VPPA and PPA considered riskier? Owning my own cow as a DG seems more risky because I know nothing about cows. I'd rather contract with someone who knows cows, feels less risky. Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. I see that was from Robin. Hi, Robin, hope you're doing well. I think, I'd answer it in two parts, I guess. First, I would say fundamentally the PPA, VPPA, the reason folks pursue it is the scale. At the DG level, when you're investing in, to keep with the cow analogy, one or two cows, the risk to you is only one or two cows big. Whereas in the PPA or VPPA, it might be the equivalent of a few hundred cows. And so if the result of that transaction is not in your favor, there's a lot more risk tied to it. I think the second part of the answer, so fundamentally it's the scale, but the second part of the answer is that at the distributed generation level, you're going to have a lot more understanding of what is that cow or what is that electricity worth to you in terms of a hedge, in terms of your own rate structure, your own plans. Whereas when you're making that commitment in a virtual power purchase agreement, and some of this has to do with the nuances of that transaction structure, which might be a little too much to go into today without some accompanying visuals, and happy to talk about that, at a later date. But the transaction structure, you're wearing most of the market risk on behalf of that entity, and that's what's allowing that entity to go out and finance their cow and ice cream factory. They know that they have a buyer who's fixing a price for them and wearing the risk that future energy is not worth that price, and therefore you owning that risk puts that risk on you. And there are, some ways that you can structure contracts and markets that you can look into, and a pretty large degree of forecasting that goes around these decisions. But that's I guess the fundamental point is that beyond the scale, it's also the type of transaction you're entering into with a virtual power purchase agreement is inherently wearing the market risk, whereas at a small scale, even though you might know nothing about cows, you know a lot about your own energy and your own costs, and that's ultimately what that small-scale project is going to be dependent on.
And a follow-up question, Matt, when it comes to the cows, is the methane created by them factored into the emissions calculations?
I'm regretting my ice cream analogy already.
Let's see, next question here from Mark. Are there studies that show this type of REC purchasing strategies actually reduce emissions, or are these reductions just on paper? You showed projected reductions, but are they real? And I would say, yes, they're definitely real. If you take all of the generation from fossil fuel-based generation, and all the carbon that is created from that production, that gives you your coefficient. So it's not something that's being done on paper. It's literally how much emissions, like point source within each grid, is generated as a proxy of what the fuel source generation is. And as people have transitioned from coal and oil alone, the grid emissions have decreased pretty drastically over the last decade by using natural gas. And as renewables have started to come into the market even more, now we're actually seeing them displace even more of that, fossil fuel-based generation. And as a result, the emissions within each grid are definitely declining. So it's not just strictly an academic discussion or an accounting. The grid is getting cleaner, the emissions within the region are cleaner, and ideally health and wellness would correlate with that as well. Next question or questions are coming from Eric and Mary. And Eric is asking, are you suggesting that a campus wishing to account for their declining electricity emissions resulting from a cleaner grid will need to purchase RECs for their electricity consumption? And Mary seconded that, wanting a little bit more clarity on what the current WRI guidance is and how the RPS comes into play. I'll hand that one to you, Matt.
Yeah, I can take a first pass here. And these are, very relevant questions right now. And part of why we wanted to raise this is that there isn't a fundamental sort of black and white answer to these. That there's a lot of nuances in emissions accounting depending on what guidance you're following and what methodology you've chosen. But in a sort of traditional location-based accounting method, new renewables on the grid, as Zach and Evan highlighted, are going to lead to a lower and lower carbon per megawatt hour number used to calculate your emissions. And so when you report your emissions inventory, you'll certainly see that benefit over time in your scope 2 emissions. However, also traditionally, when you go out to purchase renewable energy credits, you're typically buying them on a megawatt hour basis. You're not buying them based on how much carbon is associated with those megawatt hours. And for that reason, if you're using 20,000 megawatt hours in year 1 and you're still using 20,000 megawatt hours in year 10, but year 10 is that much cleaner, in traditional accounting metrics, you are likely to need to go back out and buy 20,000 RECs. Now, the market-based option allows for the use of residual emissions and claiming the renewables that your supplier might be retiring and retaining on your behalf and that you're paying for in your price. But using that residual mix is something that isn't always very clear to people. I think we've seen a lot of folks doing this emissions accounting using location-based, but also counting the RECs from the renewable portfolio standard, which does result in some double counting. So I think we just wanted to point to some of the questions here and not say that we necessarily have all the answers. I think this is a question that the wider sustainability community and many of the guidances will have to confront and haven't had to as much in the past because we haven't really been contemplating grids that are 50, 70, 80% renewable. But given the commitments that are out there by states right now and given the trends we've seen in the last 20 years, that's a reality we're hopefully confronting in the near future.
Thanks, Matt. Let's see. Question from Dave Chamberlain. When are aggregated VPPAs worth considering, and is there a megawatt hour range needed to go it alone? And I would say that the answer to that question varies, geographically. And so in the Midwest, you might have a much better resource for wind. The cost of labor is likely lower, interconnection, permitting, compared to a place like California or the Northeast. Second is, the economies of scale really will factor into this quite a bit. But you're not necessarily as an entity always, you might be going at it alone and getting one project that meets all of your needs, or even being the only person associated with the project. So just like a large commercial building gets built with many floors and has many tenants, there can be many off-takers to a project. And so you could be one percentage of that project and still get the economies of scale without needing to get the scale of the full project on your own. There might be some restrictions when it comes to contracting where you need to have more uniformity among all the off-takers for the developer to get financing. But it's certainly not the case, I guess, where you need to get to this really large size and then you can do it. We've seen a lot of examples of aggregations or partnerships where there's smaller percentage of off-takes from smaller entities that are teaming up with larger entities so that they can all participate and access this market. Next question here is from Dan. This was a follow-up to the electrification, and his question was what fuels were considered when you calculated self-generation from a CHP emissions. And so once again, we gave a range here from 600 to 1,000. It depends on the technology itself, the utilization, and the fuels. In this case, generally the fuels being used would be either ULSD or natural gas. And once again, the more efficient would be the gas, where ULSD would be less efficient. And so it just depends on the particular of the year, the weather, the technology, and the fuel, and what restrictions you might have. There's some people on interruptible supply from the natural gas pipeline, and in really cold winters, they might get cut off and have to burn ULSD. So it's changes, which is why we tried to give a range, just to give kind of a visualization of what grids are currently dirtier, which ones are already cleaner, and how those trends are proceeding. And we're closing here on 2 o'clock, or I guess we've already passed. So we'll just finish these last 2 questions. And once again, any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out, and glad to go into more detail. Last question here is coming from Eric, although he's left. And he says, I'm not sure I understand whether you were saying RECs need to be purchased to account for the cleaner grid, not behind the meter projects. Can we please follow up? And the answer is yes, we can follow up.
Also, apologies if anyone understands how to make ice cream. It's clear. All I know is that you need cows.
We all know ice cream tastes good, and as it gets hotter and hotter and we're stuck inside, I think it's an apt analogy, or at the very least, we're all hungry. Well, thanks everyone for your time. We appreciate you joining in, and look forward to future discussions. We're glad to stay here if there's any questions from the group that want to stay on, but otherwise we will end it here. Thanks, and enjoy your day.